Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the Whittemore legacy here in Naugatuck, some of which you'll know, some of which you may not. And we're going to determine a little bit about what makes a legacy. So behind me is a photo of John Howard Whittemore and his children. This is courtesy of the Naugatuck Museum. And I just want to let you all know before I really get going here that a lot of what I talk about insofar as opinions are of my own, and a lot of what I'm about to show you are in the public domain. So if you want to go out and research more yourself, you're absolutely able to. So what makes a legacy? Is it the buildings that we leave behind? Is it the art? The waterworks, the roadways that lead throughout our state? Is it the things that we're familiar with every day? No. A legacy is not just a building, because a building is nothing without the knowledge of its worth. So legacies, while cumbersome, need to be remembered with knowledge. We need to be able to know why things are significant, because without that knowledge, a building is just a building. And if a building is just a building, it becomes vulnerable to demolition, to redevelopment, to many things. An art collection is just an art collection without the knowledge that it belonged to people who are very significant in many other ways. So we're going to start back, all the way back, with a man named William Howe Whittemore. He was a preacher. He was one of the first descendants of the Whittemore family to make a name for himself. His legacy was being a person that traveled across New England to spread a message of Presbyterianism. He went to Yale College, and then Yale Divinity School, Southbury, Connecticut, Charlton, Connecticut, Newark, New Jersey, and then finally Rye, New York. William Howe's legacy has been forgotten, but there is something very significant that sustains and remains. This is the Haviland House, or the Square House Museum, located in Rye, New York. In the 1700s, it was visited by Lafayette, George Washington, Samuel and John Adams. It became a municipal center in the 1900s when the Whittemores purchased it and gave it back to the town as a municipal hall, and eventually was used by the Historical Society in Rye, New York to be the museum that you see here today. That is a legacy worth knowing. Now, we all know the story of John Howard Whittemore. Hopefully, if you live in Naugatuck, you know the story of John Howard Whittemore and Mr. Tuttle and their marriage to the iron industry in the 1800s, 1858 to be precise. So I'm not going to go over the manufacturing industry of the bygone era that many of us in our state have forgotten, because it's a narrative that goes not just here in our town, but in many towns throughout our state. Does it matter that this person was part of this many businesses? In 1871, the Tuttle and Whittemore Company, John Howard Whittemore became the president of the company, but beyond that, his reach went from the Naugatuck Malleable Iron Company to Bridgeport Malleable Iron Co., Indianapolis Malleable Iron Company, Toledo, Ohio Malleable Iron Company, say that 3 times fast, Landers, Frary and Clark Corporation in New Britain, and the North and Judd Manufacturing Company in New Britain, amongst many others. The list would not fit on the screen. But today, none of these remain. So what is his legacy today? Well, some of you may recognize this man, right? This is Alfred Pope sitting next to John Howard Whittemore sometime in the early 1900s. Alfred Pope, as many of you may know, was the benefactor and father of Theodate Pope, whose birthday is today, as we saw on Facebook. Oh yeah, I forgot. Sorry, let me go back real quick. Doop, doop, doop. I do this sometimes. Okay. Oh. Ah! Okay, here we go. Today is William Howe's birthday. It's his birthday today. So yes, it's very, very ironic. Okay, let me keep going here. So, amongst all these things, we have a partnership, a relationship that transcended not only this region, but all the way over into what used to be the Western Preserve in Ohio. When John Howard Whittemore extended his businesses into this region, he formed another partnership not unlike the one that him and Mr. Tuttle had formed in the 1850s. See, he had learned from that experience with Mr. Tuttle in the 1850s that business is nothing without mutual connections, right? Business is nothing without friendship, and this is very much how philanthropic efforts worked during this time. So Mr. Pope and Mr. Whittemore expanded their businesses together. Eventually, we know the narrative that the Pope family moved here to Connecticut, and that we have this fabulous Hillstead Museum in Farmington, which is where this photo came from in their collection. Now, beyond this legacy, right, we have the built environment. And I was going to talk a little bit about all the buildings, all the many McKim, Mead, and White buildings that we have around here today, but this is an interesting one. This is the Naugatuck National Bank before it was demolished and moved down on Church Street into the 1930s building that we know of today, right? This is a McKim, Mead & White built structure. Now, if you're not familiar with McKim, Mead & White, they were a firm out of New York that built some of the most notable buildings that we know of right now, including Rose Cliff. I'm sorry, I just blanked, and I looked at my friends who are very familiar with Rose Cliff. Rose Cliff and Newport, amongst many others, right? Some of the original train stations in our country. McKim, Mead & White was one of the most formidable firms, and over their time here in Naugatuck, built over 23 structures just here in Naugatuck, of which less than 10 remain. One of them being the Congregational Church that you know of today. There were 2 other Congregational churches in Naugatuck prior to the building of the one in 1903 by McKim, Mead & White. This is from the, oh, I forgot the laser doesn't work on here. Vanna White time. This one is from the collection of McKim, Mead & White from Columbia University. And this one is from the website of the Congregational Church today from not long after its construction near the green. Now, why was McKim, Mead & White here in Naugatuck is a very interesting thing as well. It was this idea that John Howard Whittemore had called, you know, in the scholarly field, we call it the City Beautiful movement, but it was an idea to create civic centers out of industrializing towns that needed places for citizens to feel like they were not just in industrial towns, right? That they had these places of virtue, of beauty, right? To define themselves with the growth, the philanthropic efforts that were happening in Naugatuck during that time. This is a view of Naugatuck in the late 1800s, and you can see, again, the clicker doesn't work, so Vanna White time. Right over here is the steeple of the Congregational Church in the background. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Whittemore legacies that have been left behind. Here's an image of the Naugatuck House of the Whittemores that was located on Church Street. It was demolished, but it was another McKim, Mead & White designed property that over time was renowned as one of his finest works, right? When this building was demolished, we were left with this sense of emptiness that we can still kind of feel today, right? So legacies need to be remembered, because if not, they are forgotten. But beyond what they were able to build here in Naugatuck, the Whittemore family extended themselves further. I'm going to touch a little bit upon the things that are both throughout the state, right, that are related back here to Naugatuck, that you may not know about. So, John Howard Whittemore, like many of the industrialists that I study in my profession, was really minded to the future. He wanted to give things to our state that would sustain, that would assist, right, in progressive growth, and that were beautiful. He didn't design anything that wasn't beautiful. So here's a road leading to Tranquility Farm out of Naugatuck and into Middlebury. It was designed by Warren H. Manning and a man named Mr. Elliott, who had worked for the firm Olmsted and Olmsted. Olmsted Jr. was the son of the famous Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, amongst many others here in Connecticut. When he did this, he not only purchased the rights to build the turnpikes, to build the roads that connect us to where we need to go today, especially if you've been on 84, you know what I'm talking about. But Mr. Whittemore did more than that. He gave us beauty. And this is a quote from Mr. Manning, and I'm gonna try not to trip, and I'll step to the side so I can read it for you. "No other of my clients has given more of his personal thought, action, and resources to the planning and execution of work for the improvement of his home and business town of Naugatuck and his summer hometown of Middlebury." Now, on the right, I have a little bit of a treat from you. This is from the Olmsted Archives with the National Park Service, located at Olmsted's house in New York. And these are the plans that John Howard Whittemore had with Mr. Warren H. Manning that he gave to Olmsted's firm, a planning plan for Tranquility Farm, their home of Middlebury, Connecticut. And I have a couple more things to show you with that. So as you see here, Tranquility Farm in Middlebury, Connecticut it was along Lake Quassapog, and I'm sure many of you know this, right? So I'm not trying to tell you anything you might not know, but refresh you on what maybe you do. The plan for it was to have a private residence that connected to a larger farm, right? And so when Olmsted designed it, the correspondence between him and John Howard Whittemore, of Mr. Manning and Mr. Whittemore, was to say sprawling. Whittemore kept saying words like sprawling, vistas, views. He wanted to ensure something that for his future generations, that they would be able to enjoy, sustain, and build upon even more if they wanted to. So we see here that a lot of this land in the background The northern version over here is left empty. We have a centralized garden, but the plans didn't really change from the original conception that JHW had, John Howard Whittemore had. Now this is also a tree. This is a planting list of everything that they put on the grounds at that time. You have a couple of different things, from the Japanese honeysuckle over here to the Rosa nitida, which is called the shiny rose. And finally, I think to the Spirea sumalia, which I'm not really great at my Latin, but I apologize for that. But you could see the idea again was not only to build something just to build something for his family, but to build something that was beautiful. Now, John Howard Whittemore's legacy could go beyond even that. He was a director of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad line up until his death. He was really responsible for merging and acquiring some of the smaller railroad lines, like the Hamden Railroad line, that were no longer operational and or going out of business. He really connected these things to create his legacy throughout New England and connect all of these different places. When he died, his obituary and all of his works were both in the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, the Hartford Courant, and the New York Times, from what you'll see here. But it went beyond that, right? We had the Memorial Library, we have the bridge, we have all of these structures that have the name Whittemore on them or associated with them, and yet again, we face ourselves here in 2020, right, with this lack of a progressive mindset for the future. So if we don't associate the knowledge of the man with the structures, what becomes of them? Such men as he belong alone to the present, belong not alone to the present, but to the future. It is also true that they belong to the past. They are the product not of yesterday, but of vanishing generations. We compare them not to plants of a season, but to sturdy trees sprung from a rich and fertile soil, and it is well worthwhile to search as deeply as we can amidst the roots of every large and productive life to see how the diverse elements have united to bring forth beautiful and abiding fruit. This is what Joseph Anderson, a historian in Waterbury, who wrote 3 volumes on the history of Waterbury, wrote in his memorial to John Howard Whittemore when he died. Now, that's a little bit of a complicated quote, so let me just point out a little bit to you here. These men don't belong to the past, they don't belong to the present, they belong to the future, and we need to remember that. Now, this is an interesting treat for me. So Chris told you I am the Rose Hill and Chase family historian of Chase, Brass, and Copper in Waterbury. To my delight, when I started working on the Whittemore collection, I made a very interesting connection, which was that Harris Whittemore, John Howard Whittemore's son, Arthur Harris Whittemore, was best friends with none other than Frederick Chase, which was really cool for me. So I had a wealth of information in the Naugatuck Museum's collection of these 2 rowdy young men who went to Munich, who went to Yale and then Munich together on an educational trip. Some of the notes that they passed to each other I couldn't show you today just because they are 2 rowdy young men who go to Yale. But this is a really great photo of everyone that they went to Munich with in the late 1800s. This is Frederick Chase right here, and there's Harris over there. You can't miss them. And their legacies, Harris's legacy was not that much different than his father's. He took over many of the malleable iron factories and manufacturing companies for his father. And what we know best about Harris is some of this, the art collection that they had in Middlebury. Now, there have been books and articles published about this, so I don't feel like I have to go too deeply into the Whittemore's art collection because, again, this is my opinion, and I'll be frank with you. A legacy is nothing if it's not tangibly in front of me. If I go to a museum and look at this portrait by Monet entitled The Sunrise, I'll have little idea that it was ever associated with the Whittemore family at this point, right? Because the knowledge is not there. It's not written on the text panel. It's not visible to our current generation. So this invisible past, this hidden in plain sight past, if you will, to quote Anne Smith, who wrote a book about this, I encourage you to read, is not something that we can look at today in awe like the Congregational Church and say that is Whittemore's legacy, because you would have to travel to every corner of the globe to be able to see their art collection at this point, and you would have to make every connection to every piece of art that they ever had. So up here we have a couple of significant ones, and I'll touch upon them, right? This, oh, laser's not working, darn it. Okay, ban away. Here we go. So the first photo that I showed you was Monet's haystacks, one of two of which the family owned that was in the Middlebury house on Tranquility Farm. The second was the sunrise by Monet that I showed you. This is Mrs. Harris Whittemore with her child by Marie Cassatt. And then over here we have two Whistler paintings, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But since then, every painting that you're looking at on this screen is no longer associated with the family, and much like art collections throughout history, once they're made by the artist, they're passed from hand to hand until they hang on a wall for our admiration. Again, if we didn't mention this knowledge, we wouldn't be able to associate it with the Whittemores anymore. This was their beautiful home in Middlebury, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but you can see here Symphony in White, number 1, is hanging next to both of Whistler's. Both Whistler paintings are at the top of the stairs, which I kind of tried to give you a visual here of how it would kind of carry on. So you would come up and then bang that right, millennial colloquialism, bang that right, and then you'd see it at the top of the stairs right there. The house in Middlebury was actually disassembled. Many people like to say it was demolished, but it actually was disassembled and reassembled in Salem, New York. So this McKim Mead and White structure, while it's no longer visible to us in Middlebury, lives on in another state because of legacy. It's a McKim Mead and White structure, and for some people that means something. So when it was disassembled, many of the pieces were brought to Salem, New York. It was rebuilt, and according to a very professional historic preservationist that I trust completely, portions of this house still remain in Salem, New York today. Now, we're going to wrap up a little bit, but I want to just point out another thing. So we are here in Connecticut on the East Coast, but the Whittemore legacy extends all the way into California. Whittemore Grove is located out of Humboldt Redwoods State Park. It's about in the middle of the state. It takes a little bit of a hike to get there. So from what I could read, it's about a 45-minute hike to get to the Grove, but once you get there, you have a little over 140 redwoods named in the honor of Harris Whittemore, done by his wife Justine Brockway in 1929. You can still visit it today. It is a protected piece of land because of land easements, just like Middlebury. So it wasn't just that these people were giving us these things, they were protecting them for over 100 years. A point which, now that we're in 2020, is coming very closely to reconsideration. We have to remember that, right? So again, legacy, we have to have the knowledge in order to protect it. So I encourage anyone who really likes to go hiking in this room, and I have a feeling it's a lot of you, to go to California and check out Humboldt Redwood State Park and visit a Harris Whittemore redwood. That was his wife, Justine Brockway Whittemore, who gave the land to Humboldt County. And now I have one of the finest stories that I was able to find during my time researching this collection. So once the weather gets a little nicer, we all like to head down to the shore here in Connecticut. My favorite beach is Hammonasset State Park. I go camping there with my daughter that Chris mentioned earlier. And I had never known that, in my mind, we've always had our state parks, we've always had them until we learn about them, right? And I didn't know that Hammonasset Park, prior to becoming the state beach that we all use today, was actually used by the Winchester Arms Company to test rifles. So that land was purchased actually by Arthur Harris Whittemore in the 1920s, at a time when the land was going up for sale. There were two people who wanted to buy it, himself and a woman who wanted to turn it into a private resort. She wanted to buy all the land that the arms company was using to test their weaponry. There were buildings and shooting ranges and things like that, and she wanted to turn it into a resort. And Arthur Harris Whittemore stepped in and said, I don't really like that idea. And at that time, he had been serving on the Parks Commission since 1923 and wanted to do something about it. So he purchased all the land and then rented it to the state of Connecticut for $1 until the state of Connecticut could purchase the land from him. At that time, big shock, our state didn't have the money to pay for the land themselves. So he stepped in with his philanthropic efforts, purchased it, and gave it to the state. 2 years later, they were able to purchase it in its totality, and that's why we have Hammonasset today. This is what it looked like before he purchased it. So when Arthur died unexpectedly in 1927, his son took over for him. He's pictured second over here, Harris Jr. And he served on that commission board until about 1929 and continued to preserve state parks in our state, including Naugatuck State Forest that many of you know of. But that's pretty much what I could cover for you today insofar as the legacies. So we have several generations that are giving things to the state nearly for free. $1 at that time was pretty good, even with the state. We should try to get more out of them, but they built roads. They secured water rights for entire cities, including working with the Chase family to secure water rights in Litchfield for the city of Waterbury and for Naugatuck. Many of the turnpikes that we see today, they have many of the built structures, the McKim, and Whites that we have here today, forests from there to here. And yet, do they matter if we don't know that they did them? And that's really what I want to convey to everyone today, that a legacy is nothing without knowledge. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to give you that knowledge. Now it's your turn to preserve and protect it. Thank you. And back to Chris. Thank you.